I am a 28-year-old female, and my husband, Mark, is a 30-year-old male. On Christmas morning, my mother-in-law, Carol, looked at the gift Mark had given me, and she huffed. She said, "You don't deserve this gift." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold like the winter frost on the windowpane. The cheerful sounds of crinkling wrapping paper and festive music suddenly felt hollow. Everyone in the room stopped. Mark's sister, Lisa, froze with a half-unwrapped present in her lap. Mark's father, a quiet man named George, just stared into his coffee cup as if searching for an escape. I looked down at the box in my hands. It was a beautiful watch, something I had admired months ago but never dreamed of owning. It was elegant and simple, and it felt like a symbol of Mark's love and our shared life. Now it felt tainted. Carol's words had wrapped around it like a thorny vine, squeezing the joy out of the moment. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck, even though I knew I had done nothing wrong. That was her specialty, making you feel guilty for things you never did. "Mom?" Mark started, his voice low and tight. "What did you just say?" Carol sniffed, not backing down an inch. She crossed her arms, her expression a mixture of defiance and sour satisfaction. "I said what I said," she declared to the room, though her eyes were fixed on me. Some people don't appreciate the value of things. They just take and take. I could feel the stares of everyone in the room. They were waiting for my reaction. Would I cry? Would I yell? For years I had navigated Carol's subtle digs and passive-aggressive comments with a forced smile and a quiet retreat. I'd always done it to keep the peace, for Mark's sake. I told myself it was easier to absorb her little barbs than to cause a family war. But this was different. This wasn't a whispered comment in the kitchen or a backhanded compliment. This was a public declaration of my unworthiness, delivered on a day that was supposed to be about family and love. It was a deliberate act of cruelty. I looked at Mark. His face was a storm of anger and disbelief. He had always tried to run interference, to smooth things over, but he often underestimated the depth of his mother's resentment towards me. He saw her as difficult, but I saw her as malicious. I decided in that instant that I was done being the family shock absorber. I was done smiling through the poison. I carefully placed the watch box back on the coffee table. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly. "I think I need some fresh air," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I walked out of the living room, not waiting for a response. I could hear Mark calling my name, but I didn't stop. I walked into our bedroom and shut the door, the click of the latch echoing the final snap of my patience. The peace I had worked so hard to maintain was a fragile illusion, and it had just been shattered. Something had to change, and it had to change today. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. Later that day, after the strained and awkward Christmas dinner had finally ended, the house was quiet. His family had left in a cloud of unspoken tension. Lisa had given me a weak, apologetic smile on her way out. George had avoided my gaze entirely. Carol had departed without another word to me, but the look she shot me was one of pure triumph. She had won this round, and she knew it. Mark came into the bedroom where I had been sitting for hours, just staring out the window. He sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped. He looked exhausted. "Sarah, I am so sorry," he began. I turned to look at him. "Sorry for what, Mark? For your mother's behavior? Or for letting it get to this point?" He flinched. "That's not fair," he said quietly. "I'm on your side." "Are you?" I asked, and the question was genuine. "Because for the past 5 years, I have been swallowing her insults. I have been ignoring her jabs. I have been the bigger person every single time. And where has it gotten me? Humiliated in front of your entire family on Christmas Day. She thinks she has the right to treat me like that because she has never, not once, faced a real consequence for her actions." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I know you're right. I never know what to do. She's my mother." "And I'm your wife," I replied, my voice cracking just a little. "You chose me. You are supposed to protect me. You are supposed to be my partner. But when it comes to her, I feel like I am completely alone. She walks into our house, with her own key, I might add, and acts like she is the queen and I am some unwelcome guest. She criticizes my cooking, my cleaning, my job, the way I dress, and today she declared that I don't deserve a gift from my own husband. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I can't do this anymore, Mark. I cannot live like this. I feel like I'm constantly on edge in my own home, waiting for the next insult, the next power play. It's not healthy for me, and it's not healthy for us. He looked at me, his eyes full of pain. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice pleading. "Tell me what to do, and I'll do it." This was the moment, the turning point. I had to be clear. I had to be strong. "I want her key," I said simply. "I want her key back. She does not get to have free access to our home, to our private space anymore. She has proven that she cannot be trusted with that privilege. She can call before she comes over, like a normal person. She can be a guest in our home, not a resident critic." Mark was silent for a long time. I could see the conflict warring on his face. He loved his mother, I knew that. But this was about more than a key. It was about boundaries. It was about whose feelings mattered more in our marriage, mine or his mother's. "Okay," he said finally, his voice firm. He stood up and walked over to me. He took my hands in his. "You're right. You are absolutely right. This has gone on for far too long. I've been a coward. I've been trying to please everyone, and in the end, I've just hurt you. That stops now." He pulled me into a hug, and I let myself lean against him, feeling a tiny sliver of hope. "I'll go over there tomorrow and get it," he promised. "I'll make it clear that things are going to be different from now on." I held on to him, not sure if I should believe him. He had made promises before, but this time felt different. The cruelty of his mother's words had been so blatant, so undeniable, that it seemed to have finally shaken him out of his complacency. He had been forced to see her not as his loving, if difficult, mother, but as the woman who was actively trying to destroy his wife's happiness. The battle had been a long time coming, but the fight for our peace had just begun. And it all started with a small piece of metal, a key that unlocked so much more than just our front door. The next day, the atmosphere in our house was thick with a nervous energy. Mark was quiet during breakfast, his jaw set in a determined line. I watched him, a mix of hope and anxiety churning in my stomach. This was a huge step for him. For his entire life, he had been conditioned to placate his mother, to avoid her wrath at all costs. Now, he was preparing to walk directly into the storm. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked up from his uneaten toast and met my eyes. "I've never been more sure about anything," he said. "She hurt you, Sarah. She did it in our home, on a day that was supposed to be happy. There have to be consequences. You were right." His conviction was reassuring, but I still felt a sense of dread. I knew Carol. She would not take this well. She would see it as a declaration of war, orchestrated by me. She would twist it, turn herself into the victim, the poor, aging mother whose ungrateful son was being controlled by his manipulative wife. "She's going to blame me," I said. "Let her," Mark replied, his tone hard. "I don't care who she blames. This is my decision. I'm the one who is going to her house. I'm the one who is going to ask for the key. You're not even going to be there. This is between me and her." He left an hour later. I watched from the window as his car pulled out of the driveway. The house felt unnervingly quiet. I tried to distract myself. I cleaned the kitchen. I did a load of laundry. I put away the Christmas decorations, packing away the ornaments and lights with a heavy heart. The joy of the season had been thoroughly extinguished. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat. I was expecting an angry text from Carol or maybe Lisa, but nothing came. The silence was almost worse than an explosion. It felt like the eerie calm before a hurricane. 2 hours later, Mark came home. He walked in the door, and I could see immediately that it had been bad. His face was pale and drawn. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked over to the small bowl on the entryway table where we kept our keys and dropped a single, familiar key into it. The clinking sound it made was loud in the silent house. He finally looked at me. "It's done," he said, his voice flat. "What happened?" I asked, walking over to him. He sighed, a long, ragged breath. "It was exactly what you'd expect," he said. "She cried. She yelled. She told me I was breaking her heart. She said you had poisoned me against her." I felt a familiar pang of guilt, immediately followed by anger. "What did you say?" "I told her the truth," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I told her that this was my decision. I told her that her behavior yesterday was unacceptable and that there needed to be a change. I told her that she hurt my wife and that I would not stand for it anymore." "And the key?" I prompted gently. "She refused to give it to me at first," he admitted. "She said she needed it for emergencies. I told her that in an emergency, she could call 911 just like everyone else. I told her that if she didn't give it to me, I would call a locksmith and have the locks changed today, and I would send her the bill. That's when she finally threw it at me." I pictured the scene in my mind. Carol, her face contorted in rage, throwing the key at her own son. It was ugly, but it was also validating. This was the side of her that Mark had so often refused to see. "She said not to expect to hear from her again," Mark finished, his voice heavy with sadness. "She said I had made my choice." "She's trying to manipulate you, Mark," I said, putting my hand on his arm. "She's punishing you for standing up to her. She'll come around when she realizes her tactics aren't working." "I hope so," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. I knew this was hard for him. Despite everything, she was still his mother. But as I looked at the key sitting in the bowl, I felt a profound sense of relief. A weight I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying had been lifted. For the first time in years, I felt like my home was truly my own. It was a fortress, and we had just pulled up the drawbridge. The peace was temporary, I was sure of that. Carol would retaliate. But for now, we were safe. We had drawn a line in the sand, and for the first time, we were standing on the same side of it. The retaliation came sooner than I expected. It wasn't a direct assault, a screaming phone call, or a barrage of angry texts. Carol was more cunning than that. Her campaign was one of whispers and shadows, a slow poisoning of the well. It began with Lisa. She called me 2 days after the key incident. Her tone was syrupy sweet, oozing with false concern. "Sarah, hi," she began. "I was just calling to see how you were doing. Things seemed so tense on Christmas." "We're fine, Lisa," I said, keeping my voice neutral. I knew this was not a friendly check-in. This was a reconnaissance mission. "Oh, good," she said, though she sounded disappointed. "It's just that Mom is an absolute wreck. She hasn't stopped crying. She says Mark came over and just screamed at her and demanded her key. She feels so unwelcome, so pushed out of the family." I took a slow breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "That's not what happened, Lisa, and I think you know that." Mark didn't scream. He stated a boundary that was long overdue. "Your mother's behavior on Christmas was cruel, and there needed to be a consequence." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, she's very fragile right now," Lisa said, her voice turning defensive. "She's not young, you know. All this stress is bad for her heart. She thinks you've turned Mark against her completely." "Mark made his own decision," I stated firmly. "He saw what she did. This isn't about me. It's about her actions." "She says you've always had it in for her," Lisa pressed on, ignoring my point. "She says you were jealous of her relationship with Mark from the very beginning. The accusations were so absurd, so twisted from reality, that I almost laughed. Jealous? Lisa, I have done nothing but try to have a peaceful relationship with your mother for 5 years. She is the one who has been hostile from day one. Do you honestly not see that?" "I just see that my mother is hurting," she said, her voice cold now. "And I think you're being very selfish. Family should be more forgiving." "Forgiveness doesn't mean you allow someone to keep hurting you," I shot back. "There's a difference. And right now, Mark and I are focusing on our own home, our own peace. I'm sorry your mother is upset, but her feelings are a result of her own choices." We ended the call on that strained note. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking with anger. It was starting. Carol was painting me as the villain, the cold-hearted daughter-in-law who had ripped a loving family apart. And Lisa, ever the loyal daughter, was her willing mouthpiece. A few days later, Mark got a call from his aunt, Carol's sister. She had heard a similarly dramatic and one-sided story. "Mark, your mother is devastated," she had said. "She told me you two had a terrible fight and you took her key. She feels like she's lost her son." Mark, to his credit, held the line. He calmly explained the situation, focusing on his mother's behavior and the need for boundaries. But I could tell the calls were wearing on him. He was being forced to defend our decision to a jury of relatives who had only heard his mother's tearful, manipulated version of the events. The real sign that something was off, however, was subtler. I was paying our bills online a week after Christmas when I noticed our credit card statement. There was a charge from a high-end department store for nearly $500. It was dated a few weeks before Christmas. "Mark," I called out, "did you buy something expensive at Bloomingdale's last month?" He came into the office, looking over my shoulder. He frowned. "No," he said. "I haven't been there in ages. What is it?" "It's a charge for $480, I said. "I definitely didn't buy anything there." We stared at the screen, puzzled. "Maybe it's a mistake," he suggested, "or fraud." "Maybe," I said, but a cold knot of suspicion was forming in my stomach. Carol had a supplementary card on our account. It was supposed to be for emergencies only, a relic from a time before Mark and I had fully merged our finances, and I had, foolishly, agreed to it to keep the peace. She had never used it before, as far as I knew. "I'm going to call the credit card company," I said. "But, Mark, do you think your mom—" He looked uncomfortable. "She wouldn't do that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. She would have asked. But would she? I thought. The woman who had looked me in the eye and told me I didn't deserve a gift from my husband. The woman who was now systematically trying to turn his entire family against me. I was starting to realize I didn't know what she was and wasn't capable of. I made the call. After 20 minutes on hold, a polite customer service representative confirmed the charge. It had been made in person at the store. They couldn't tell me who made it, but they could confirm the location and time. After I hung up, I sat there for a moment, the pieces clicking into place in my mind. The timing, just before Christmas, the high-end store, the secrecy. I remembered a comment Carol had made on Christmas morning while opening a gift from Lisa. It was a designer scarf. "Oh, this is lovely," Carol had cooed. "It will go perfectly with the new coat I bought myself for the holidays." At the time, the comment had just seemed like another example of her self-centered nature. But now, it seemed sinister. Had she bought a new designer coat for herself using our money? And if she had, what else had she done? The key was just one part of her entitlement. I was beginning to suspect her access to our lives and our finances ran much deeper than I had ever imagined. My investigation had just begun. The next few days were a quiet storm of discovery. Armed with a growing sense of dread, I decided to do a deep dive into all of our finances. I started with the credit card statements, going back a full year. Mark was hesitant at first. He felt like we were snooping, violating his mother's privacy. "She's an authorized user on our account, Mark," I argued gently, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "We have a right to see where our money is going. This isn't about snooping. It's about finding out if that Bloomingdale's charge was a one-time thing or part of a pattern." Reluctantly, he agreed. We sat together at the dining room table, our laptops open, a pot of coffee brewing between us. The mood was somber, like we were preparing for bad news. It didn't take long to find more inconsistencies. There were small charges at first, scattered over the months. A $30 lunch here. A $50 trip to the salon there. They were small enough to fly under the radar, easily mistaken for one of my own purchases if I wasn't looking closely. But when I added them up, they amounted to several $100s. "I don't understand," Mark said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Why wouldn't she just ask me if she needed money?" "Because then she would have to explain what it was for," I said, my voice tight. "This way, she just takes it. It's about control, Mark, and entitlement. She feels she's owed this." As I clicked through the older statements, I found something bigger. A charge for over $1,000 to an airline. The date was from last summer. I remembered that time well. Carol had taken a last-minute trip to visit her cousin in Florida. She had told us the cousin was paying for her flight as a birthday gift. "Mark, look at this," I said, turning my laptop towards him. He stared at the screen, his face paling. "No," he whispered. "That can't be right. Her cousin paid for that trip. She told us." "Apparently not," I said grimly. "She lied, Mark. She lied and used our money to fund her vacation, and then she let us believe someone else had been generous to her." The betrayal was sharp and ugly. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the calculated deception. She had constructed an entire narrative of lies, all while accepting our hospitality, eating our food, and criticizing my every move. Mark stood up and started pacing the room. "I feel like an idiot," he said, his voice thick with anger and shame. "All these years, I defended her. I made excuses for her. I told you she just had a funny way of showing she cares. What a fool I've been!" "You're not a fool," I said, getting up and putting my arms around him. "You wanted to believe the best of your mother. That's normal. She's the one who took advantage of your trust." But my words felt hollow, even to me. The truth was, I had tried to warn him in subtle ways for years. I had pointed out the inconsistencies in her stories, her manipulative behavior, but he had never been ready to see it. Now the proof was undeniable, laid out in black and white on our financial statements. Our investigation didn't stop there. The credit card was linked to our main checking account. I decided to scrutinize the bank statements next. This was where things took a darker turn. We found a series of regular cash withdrawals from an ATM near her house, not large amounts, usually $100 or $200 at a time, twice a month, but they were consistent, every month, for years. "What is this?" I asked, pointing to the recurring debits. "Did you give her permission to withdraw cash?" Mark looked completely bewildered. "No, never. My God, Sarah, how much is this in total?" We did the math. It was staggering. Over the past 3 years alone, it was more than $10,000. A slow, steady drain on our savings. A secret tax we had been paying for her unexplained expenses. "I feel sick," I said, leaning back in my chair. The room felt like it was closing in on me. The sense of violation was overwhelming. She hadn't just overstepped a boundary by having a key. She had tunneled directly into the foundation of our lives, siphoning off our resources, our future, for her own selfish purposes. Mark stopped pacing and sat down heavily. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "This is so much worse than I thought," he said, his voice barely audible. "This isn't just about her being mean to you. This is theft." "Yes," I said, it is." We sat in silence for a long time, the damning evidence glowing on the screens in front of us. The picture of Carol was changing rapidly in our minds. She wasn't just a difficult, narcissistic mother. She was a liar. She was a thief. And we had to figure out what we were going to do about it. The stakes had just been raised, far higher than I could have ever imagined. The days following our financial discoveries were filled with a tense, quiet purpose. Mark and I operated like a team with a secret mission. The anger and shock had coalesced into a steely determination. We were no longer just reacting to Carol's provocations. We were building a case. We needed to understand not just what she had done, but why. Mark made a difficult phone call. He called his father, George. It was a gamble. George had always been a passive figure in the family, a man who preferred to retreat into his workshop rather than engage in conflict. We didn't know if he was aware of Carol's actions, or if he was simply another victim of her manipulations. Mark put the phone on speaker so I could listen. "Dad," he started, his voice steady, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. It's about Mom." There was a weary sigh on the other end of the line. "What has she done now, son?" George asked. The question itself was telling. It wasn't, "What's wrong?" or "Is she okay?" It was, "What has she done now?" He knew. On some level, he had to know. Sarah and I found some things on our bank statements, Mark explained carefully. Regular cash withdrawals made near your house. Charges for things Mom told us were gifts from other people. It adds up to a lot of money, Dad. The silence stretched on for so long I thought George had hung up. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. I was afraid of this, he said. I've been seeing the packages arrive. The new clothes, the jewelry. I'd ask her where the money came from, and she'd have a story. A little win on a scratch ticket. A dividend from an old stock I'd forgotten about. I knew they were lies, but it was easier to believe them, I suppose. So you knew she was spending a lot of money? Mark pressed. Do you know where it's going? Another sigh, deeper this time. She goes to the casino, Mark, George said, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. Not often at first. Just a bus trip with her friends once a month. But it's become more. She goes by herself now during the week. She thinks, I don't know, but I see the mileage on the car. I smell the smoke on her clothes when she comes home. She's been chasing losses for a year, maybe more. I tried to talk to her about it, but she just screamed at me, said it was her only bit of fun, said I was trying to control her. A casino. It clicked into place with sickening clarity. The steady need for cash, the secrecy, the lies. It wasn't just about a sense of entitlement. It was an addiction. Our money had been fueling her gambling. Why didn't you tell me, Dad? Mark asked, his voice filled with hurt. What was I supposed to say? George sounded defeated. That your mother is a gambler and a liar. I was ashamed, son. I am ashamed. I've been trying to cover the household shortfalls out of my pension. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to destroy your image of her. My image of her is already destroyed, Mark said flatly. Thank you for telling me, Dad. I'm sorry you've been dealing with this alone. After the call, a new kind of anger settled over me. It was a cold, protective rage. Carol hadn't just stolen from us. She had been systematically deceiving and draining her own husband, a quiet man who had worked his whole life to provide for his family. She had put their financial security at risk for the cheap thrill of a slot machine. The pressure from the rest of the family continued. Lisa called again, this time in tears. Mom says you're trying to turn Dad against her now, she wailed. She's all alone. You're tearing this family apart. This time I felt no sympathy. Your mother is a thief, Lisa, I said, my voice like ice. She has been stealing thousands of dollars from me and Mark. She has been lying to all of us to cover up a gambling problem. So you can stop calling me with these guilt trips. You should be worried about your mother's addiction, not my supposed role in tearing the family apart. Your mother did that all on her own. I hung up before she could respond. I was done being gentle. I was done trying to make them see reason. The truth was a weapon, and I was no longer afraid to use it. That night, Mark and I sat down and made a plan. We documented everything. We printed out the bank statements and credit card bills, highlighting every suspicious charge. We created a spreadsheet, tallying up the total amount she had taken. The final number was shocking. It was over $15,000, enough for a down payment on a car, enough for a life-changing vacation, enough to have made a real difference in our lives. Instead, it had been fed into a machine, lost in a haze of smoke and flashing lights. We have to confront her, Mark said, his face grim as he stared at the total. But we have to do it the right way. Not in a shouting match over the phone. We need to do it in person. And we need witnesses. What are you thinking? I asked. I'm thinking of my birthday, he said, a strategic glint in his eye. His birthday was in 2 weeks. I'll invite everyone over for dinner. Mom, Dad, Lisa. I'll tell them I want to put all the drama behind us and have a nice family celebration. I understood immediately. It was a trap, a perfectly set stage for the final confrontation. We would present her with the evidence in a controlled environment, in front of the very people she had been lying to. She would have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She won't be able to twist the story if everyone hears the truth from our mouths, with proof in our hands, I said, the plan solidifying in my mind. Exactly, he said. She relies on her ability to isolate people and feed them her version of events. We're going to take that power away from her. A strange sense of calm washed over me. The fear and anxiety were gone, replaced by a cold, clear focus. For years, I had been a pawn in Carol's games. Now, I was finally going to checkmate the queen. The 2 weeks leading up to Mark's birthday dinner were the longest of my life. We moved through our days with a shared secret purpose. On the surface, everything was normal. We went to work, we made dinner, we watched movies, but underneath, the tension was building. We were preparing for a battle that would redefine our family forever. Mark made the call to his mother to invite her. I listened on his end of the conversation. His voice was light and cheerful, a masterful performance. "Hey, Mom," he said. "I know things have been tense lately, and I hate it. It's my birthday next Saturday, and all I want is to have the family together. No drama, just a nice dinner. Can you and Dad come?" There was a long pause. I could imagine Carol on the other end, suspicious, trying to read the angle. Her silence was a testament to her manipulative mind. She couldn't comprehend a gesture that wasn't part of some larger scheme. "I don't know, Mark," she said finally, her voice dripping with martyrdom. "I'm not sure I'd be welcome. Sarah doesn't seem to want me around." "This isn't about Sarah," Mark said smoothly, sticking to the script we had rehearsed. "This is about me. It's my birthday. I want my mom there. Please?" The plea to her ego worked. The idea that she was so essential to his happiness that he would beg for her presence was irresistible to her. "Well, if it's that important to you," she conceded, "I suppose your father and I can be there." "Great," Mark said. "Lisa is coming too. See you Saturday at 7. He hung up the phone and looked at me, letting out a long breath. "Phase 1 complete," he said. She took the bait. The day of the dinner, our house was a strange mix of domesticity and a military command center. I cooked a roast, a deliberate choice. It was a classic, comforting family meal, a stark contrast to the ugly confrontation we were about to orchestrate. As I peeled potatoes and chopped carrots, I felt an almost out-of-body calm. Mark, meanwhile, was arranging the evidence. We had printed everything: the credit card statements with the airline tickets, and designer purchases highlighted, the bank statements with the cash withdrawals circled in red, and the final spreadsheet showing the grand total she had stolen. We placed it all in a large manila envelope, which we put on the sideboard in the dining room ready to be deployed. We talked through the plan one last time. Mark would lead the conversation. He would start by thanking everyone for coming, setting a calm tone. Then he would say that before they could truly move forward, they needed to address the real reason for the tension in the family. He would speak directly to his mother. I would only speak if I needed to clarify a point or if she tried to lie about something that directly involved me. We agreed not to raise our voices. We would present the facts calmly and let the evidence speak for itself. As 7 o'clock approached, my heart began to pound a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was it. There was no turning back. Lisa arrived first, her demeanor cautious. She gave me a tentative hug. "Smells good in here," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Thanks," I said, keeping it simple. Then George and Carol arrived. George looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room. Carol, however, was a picture of regal composure. She was wearing a new, expensive-looking blouse, which I suspected we had probably paid for. She swept into the room, kissed Mark on the cheek, and gave me a nod so frosty it could have chilled the wine. "Happy birthday, darling," she said to Mark, handing him a gift bag. "I'm so glad you came to your senses and realized how important family is." The patronizing comment, the sheer audacity of it, sent a jolt of anger through me, but I held my tongue. Let her feel confident. Let her think she was in control. Her fall would be that much harder. We made it through drinks and appetizers with strained small talk. Lisa chattered nervously about work. George asked Mark about a project in the garage. Carol sat on the sofa like a queen holding court, making pointed comments about how tired I looked. I just smiled and refilled her wine glass. Finally, we all sat down at the dining table. The roast was on the platter. The potatoes were golden. The green beans were steaming. It looked like a perfect family dinner. Mark stood at the head of the table. "Thanks, everyone, for coming," he began, his voice calm and clear. It means a lot to have you all here. Carol beamed at him, preening. Of course, sweetie. We wouldn't miss it. And I want us to be a family that can be honest with each other, Mark continued, his eyes shifting to his mother. And lately, there has been a lot of dishonesty, and we can't move forward until we deal with it. The smile on Carol's face faltered. Lisa looked from Mark to her mother, her expression confused. George seemed to shrink in his chair, bracing himself. Mark walked over to the sideboard and picked up the manila envelope. He came back to the table and placed it in front of his mother. Mom, he said, his voice no longer warm but cold and serious, we need to talk about where our money has been going. The air in the room crackled with tension. Carol stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. Her carefully constructed facade began to crumble, and for the first time that night, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. The show was about to begin. Carol stared at the envelope, her face a mask of confusion and indignation. What is this? She demanded, her voice sharp. What are you talking about, Mark? Is this her doing? She shot a venomous glare in my direction. This has nothing to do with Sarah, Mark said, his voice firm and unwavering. He pulled the chair out next to his mother and sat down so he was facing her directly. This has to do with you, and with this. He tapped the envelope. Open it, Mom. She hesitated, her hands hovering over the clasp. Lisa looked on, her mouth slightly agape. Mark, what's going on? She asked, her voice trembling. You're scaring her. The truth can be scary, Lisa, Mark said without taking his eyes off Carol. Go on, Mom. Open it. With a shaky hand, Carol opened the envelope and pulled out the stack of papers. Her eyes scanned the first page, a credit card statement with the Bloomingdale's charge highlighted in bright yellow. Her composure, so solid just moments before, began to crack. This is a mistake, she stammered, shuffling through the papers. A bank error. You know how they are. Is the airline ticket to Florida a bank error too? Mark asked calmly. The one for the trip your cousin supposedly paid for? Carol's face went white. She looked up at Mark, her eyes wide with panic. I was going to pay you back, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I was just short that month. And what about the cash withdrawals? Mark continued, his voice relentless. He pointed to one of the bank statements. $200, taken from the ATM a block from your house. And here again, 2 weeks later, and again, for 3 years, Mom. Were you planning to pay that back too? Carol was cornered. She looked from the papers to Mark, then to me, then to her husband. George wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at his plate, his silence a damning confirmation. It was for emergencies, she finally burst out, her voice rising. For groceries, for bills. Your father's pension isn't enough. I didn't want to worry you. I was trying to protect you both. It was a masterful performance of a cornered liar. She was trying to paint herself as a struggling matriarch, forced to take desperate measures to keep her household afloat. Protect us? I spoke for the first time, my voice low and cold. You bought a designer coat, Carol. You took a vacation. You went to the salon. These are not groceries. You stay out of this, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. This is a family matter. You've been poisoning him against me since the day you met him. Enough, Mark said, his voice like a clap of thunder. The room fell silent. Do not speak to my wife that way. And stop lying. He pushed the final spreadsheet across the table so it was directly in front of her. $15,427. That's the total. That's what you have stolen from us. He then turned to his father. Dad, tell them what you told me. Tell them where the money really went. George looked up, his face etched with pain. He looked at his wife, and for the first time, I saw not fear, but a profound disappointment. She's been gambling, Mark, he said, his voice heavy. The casino. It's all gone. The confession hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. Lisa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Gambling? Mom? No, that's not true. It is true, George said, his gaze fixed on his wife. Isn't it, Carol? All eyes were on Carol. The lies, the manipulations, the web of deceit she had so carefully woven for years had been torn apart in a matter of minutes. She had nowhere left to hide. Her face crumpled. The arrogant queen disappeared, replaced by a sullen, resentful child. "It's not a big deal," she muttered, refusing to look at anyone. "It's just a bit of fun, and you have plenty of money. You can afford it. After all I've done for you, raising you, I'm entitled to a little something back." The sheer, unadulterated entitlement of that statement was breathtaking. There was no remorse. No apology, only the bitter justification of a thief who believed she had every right to what she had taken. Mark just shook his head slowly, a look of deep, profound sadness on his face. "Entitled?" he repeated, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of his shattered illusions. "You weren't entitled to it, Mom. You stole it. From me, from Sarah, and from Dad. You lied to all of us. And it's over." He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "The dinner is over," he announced to the stunned room. "I think it's time for you all to leave." The aftermath was a quiet, hollow affair. No one touched the beautiful roast I had cooked. Lisa, for once, was speechless. She helped her mother, who was now weeping silent, angry tears, into her coat. George stood by the door, his shoulders slumped, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in one evening. Before she left, Carol turned to look at me one last time. Her face was a mess of tear-streaked makeup and pure, unadulterated hatred. "I hope you're happy," she spat. "You finally won. You've destroyed this family." "You did this, Carol," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "This is all on you." She just shook her head and walked out the door, with her husband and daughter trailing behind her like attendants at a funeral. The door clicked shut, and the silence they left behind was vast and absolute. Mark and I stood in the dining room, surrounded by the evidence of our ruined family dinner. He walked over to me and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me in close. I could feel him trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered into my hair. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." "You see it now," I said, holding him tightly. "That's all that matters." We had done it. We had exposed the truth. It was ugly and painful, but it was out in the open. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Carol's reign of manipulation was over. The cost was high, perhaps the complete fracturing of Mark's family, but the price of our peace had finally been paid. As I looked at the untouched meal, I realized I wasn't hungry. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. In the days that followed the disastrous birthday dinner, a new, fragile peace settled over our home. The silence from Mark's family was absolute. No angry phone calls from Lisa, no manipulative texts from Carol. It was as if they had fallen off the face of the earth. For the first few days, the quiet felt like a relief, a much-needed respite after years of emotional turmoil. But as the silence stretched on, it began to feel heavy, like an unanswered question hanging in the air. Mark and I talked a lot during that time. We talked about his mother, about his feelings of betrayal and sadness. He was grieving, not for the mother he had just confronted, but for the mother he had always believed he had. It was a painful process, but it was one we went through together. Our partnership, which had been strained by his mother's interference for so long, had been forged into something much stronger in the crucible of this conflict. We were a team, united and absolute. We also had to decide on the practicalities. The $15,000 was a significant amount of money. We couldn't just let it go. We agreed that we needed a formal plan for repayment. About a week after the dinner, Mark called his father. He wanted to check on him and to discuss the next steps. "Dad, how are you holding up?" Mark asked, his voice full of concern. "I'm all right, son." George's voice was tired but steady. "It's been quiet here. Your mother isn't speaking to me. She stays in her room most of the day." "I'm sorry, Dad," Mark said. "Don't be," George replied. "This needed to happen. I was a coward for letting it go on as long as I did. I enabled her, in my own way. The quiet is better than the lies." There was a pause. "What are you and Sarah going to do about the money?" "That's what I wanted to talk about," Mark said. We can't just forget about it. We want her to pay it back. We're going to draft a repayment agreement. A set amount every month until it's paid in full. She'll never agree to that, George said with a sigh. She has too much pride. Then we'll have to consider other options, Mark said, his tone firm. We have the documentation. This is theft, Dad. We don't want to go down a legal route, but we will if we're forced to. We need her to understand that her actions have real, tangible consequences. I understand, George said. Let me talk to her. Maybe hearing it from me will make a difference. We weren't hopeful, but we agreed to let George try. 2 days later, he called back. The conversation had not gone well. Carol had refused to discuss the matter. She maintained that the money was owed to her and that we were cruel and ungrateful for trying to extort it from her. She had threatened to tell everyone in their extended family and social circle that we were financially abusing her in her old age. So she's doubling down on the victim narrative, I said to Mark after the call. I'm not surprised. Neither am I, he said, his face set. Okay, plan B. Our plan B was Lisa. We knew she was still under her mother's spell, but she was also more pragmatic than Carol. We hoped we could make her understand the seriousness of the situation. Mark called her. He laid out the situation in stark, simple terms. Lisa, Mom stole over $15,000 from us to fund a gambling habit. We have asked her to pay it back, and she has refused. We are trying to handle this within the family, but if she will not cooperate, we will be forced to explore legal action. We don't want to do that. It would be humiliating for the entire family. We need you to talk to her. We need you to make her see reason. Lisa was silent for a moment. I could hear her crying softly. I don't know what to believe, she whispered. She says you're lying, that you're twisting everything. Lisa, you were at the dinner, Mark said patiently. You saw the bank statements. You heard Dad confirm it. At what point are you going to stop making excuses for her and face the truth? This isn't just about her feelings anymore. This is a serious problem. She needs help, and she needs to be held accountable. What do you want me to do? She asked, sounding lost. Talk to her, Mark repeated. Tell her that Sarah and I are not bluffing. We will have a lawyer send her a formal letter if we have to. Tell her that if she wants to avoid a public, legal humiliation, she needs to sign a repayment agreement. It's her only way out of this without burning everything to the ground. The threat of legal action, of public shame, was the leverage we needed. It was a language Carol would understand. Her public image, her carefully curated facade of the perfect mother and grandmother, was her most prized possession. The thought of that being shattered in a courtroom would be her worst nightmare. Another week went by. The silence was broken by an email. It was from Lisa. Attached was a scanned document. It was a simple repayment contract that Mark had drafted, outlining a monthly payment schedule. At the bottom, in shaky, angry handwriting, was Carol's signature. The email from Lisa was brief. She signed it. She wants you to know that she is only doing this to stop you from harassing her. She will mail the checks. Don't contact her again. Mark and I looked at the signature on the screen. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt. But it was an acknowledgement of the debt. It was a victory. A bitter, painful victory, but a victory nonetheless. The first check arrived a week later. It was for the exact amount specified in the agreement, not a penny more. There was no note, just the check, with her name signed at the bottom. We deposited it without a word. The fallout continued to ripple through the family. We heard from Mark's aunt, the one who had called him before, full of concern for Carol. This time, her tone was different. George called me, she said. He told me everything. I'm so sorry, Mark. I had no idea. Your mother, she has a way of twisting things. We all just believed her. It was a small thing, but it was a validation that the truth was slowly winning out over the lies. Life settled into a new normal, a quieter normal. There were no more surprise visits, no more passive-aggressive comments during holiday dinners, no more feeling on edge in my own home. The house was ours. The peace was ours. The watch Mark had given me for Christmas sat in my jewelry box. For a while, I couldn't look at it without remembering his mother's cruel words. But one morning, I decided to put it on. It felt cool and solid on my wrist. It was just a watch, a beautiful gift from my husband. I decided that I wouldn't let her memory taint it, or anything else in my life, ever again. She had taken enough. We had won. We had reclaimed our lives and our finances, but it was a somber win. A family had been broken, and the scars would likely never fully fade. But as I looked at Mark, and the new, honest strength in his eyes, I knew we had made the right choice. We had chosen each other. We had chosen peace. And that was a gift more precious than anything money could buy.